Welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining us. We're just going to give a couple of minutes here for everybody that has registered to join, although it looks like people are piling in here quickly. So hang tight, give us a couple of minutes. And if you think of it or want to practice using the chat, you could just type into the chat there where you're watching this from tonight. Oh, it's saying that chat is disabled. Well, that's not very helpful. Okay, it should be enabled now. If you want to put into the chat where you are watching from, that would be great. I thought it was strange that nobody was answering. There we go. For those of you that have just popping in here, thanks for joining us. We're going to give a couple of minutes here for everybody to join us. Thank you for being here. And if you think of it, go ahead and type into the chat where you're watching from tonight. I'll give one more minute here for everybody to join in. Deal with all the technical difficulties that seem to flood us at these times. Thanks for joining us. Okay, it seems like people are slowing down in their logins here, so we'll go ahead and get started. Good evening, everybody. My name is Rich Hatfield. I am a senior conservation biologist for the Xerces Society. I am based in Portland, Oregon, and I direct our conservation programs for bumblebees for the Xerces Society. I'm really, really happy to have you all here this evening for the first training for the Missouri Bumble Bee Atlas. We're really excited to be launching this project with some great partners and are really looking forward to launching this project and getting started in earnest on bumblebee conservation throughout the state of Missouri. Before we get started, I just want to lay down a couple of ground rules. You notice there's a chat option and there's also a question and answer option that you'll see in the bar at the bottom of the screen there. We ask that you use the chat for sort of standard chat things. If you want to share information or URL, you are welcome to do that there. I will also be sharing URLs of materials throughout the course of the webinar. So keep your eyes on the chat there for some of that information. If you have a specific question that you would like to be addressed by any of the panelists, please use the question and answer and do not type your questions into the chat. It's hard to monitor both of those things the whole time, especially the chat tends to move very quickly. So if you have a specific question that you'd like to have addressed by one of the panelists, either in written, in writing or answered live, then please type it into the question and answer. I'll also ask that you refrain from using the raise your hand feature on Zoom. I've just, as someone who's been doing quite a bit of webinars over the last 4 months or so, whenever you raise your hand, it actually creates kind of a green flash on the screen for those of us that are presenting. And I know that I personally find that to be a little bit distracting, and I think others do as well. So please, if you think of it, refrain from using the raise your hand feature and just use the question and answer and the chat. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to my partners and let them introduce themselves.
I'll go first. I'm Bill White with the Missouri Department of Conservation. I'm based out in Jefferson City, and I serve Missouri as the branch chief for community and private land conservation.
I'm Casey Berthold. I'm the Missouri State Coordinator for Pheasants Forever and Quail Forever. And we're the Habitat organization, excited to be part of this partnership. Our farm biologists are scattered around the state. We've got about 20 of them, or 20 Pheasants Forever and Quail Forever employees, and those farm biologists supported by MDC and NRCS partnerships work with private landowners to help with private land management and really take that natural community model. And so that's part of why we're involved in this effort too, is that we know if we're putting in great habitat for bumblebees, we're doing great things for quail and other wildlife too. So excited to be part of this. Thank you.
All right, and my name is Katie Lamke, and I'm also with the Xerces Society. I'm a bumblebee conservation specialist. So I'll be heading up this project with everybody else, and I also oversee the Nebraska Bumble Bee Atlas. And we also have one more partner, the University of Missouri, who is not here with us tonight. And with that, I think we'll get started. So let me share my screen here. Okay, so this is a two-part training series, as most of you should have seen when you registered on Zoom. Tonight we're going to be going over just an introduction to the Atlas project and how you can participate. And after I'm done going through that, I'm going to pass it off to Rich, who's going to go over bumblebee ecology, as well as their conservation status and some of the actions that are being taken right now to help protect bumblebees. And then tomorrow night at the same time is when we're going to dive into the nitty-gritty details of how you actually participate in the Atlas, how you collect bumblebees, how you take down the data and submit the data. And we're also going to go over how to identify bumblebees and some of the different species that you might come across in the state. So the Xerces Society, just to start off, we are a nonprofit science-based organization that works to conserve invertebrates as well as the habitat that they need to survive. So we have a whole bunch of different programs that deal with agricultural biodiversity, aquatic inverts, butterfly conservation, endangered species, some like bumblebees or butterflies. We deal with pesticides, pollinator habitat, pretty much anything that has to do with invertebrates we have our hands in one way or another. And we focus on invertebrates because almost 95% of the biodiversity seen on Earth, so that's all the different species of plants, fungi, birds, anything that's living on Earth, 95% of those different species are made up of invertebrates. And so they help with things like decomposition, biocontrol. They serve as the base of the food chain for many different species of birds or fish. And in particular to today's focus, they really help with pollination services. And the biggest thing about Xerces is that we are donor funded. So we're able to keep continuing this important work thanks to people like you who become members. So if you would like to become a member of the Xerces Society, you can log on to xerces.org/donate. And you can find a whole bunch of resources on there. We also send out different newsletters and essays on insect conservation. And so now we're going to dive into the Atlas, which is a collaborative effort that we're starting to track and conserve Missouri's native bumblebees. And so instead of just having the partners here go out and trek around the state of Missouri, we're actually going to get the help of everybody in the state who wants to. So anybody that wants to volunteer and go out and find bumblebees in Missouri, that's what the goal of this project is, right? We're all going to work together to really increase our understanding of bumblebees in the state. And we're doing this because pollinators are a very important organism on the landscape, right? So pollinators obviously carry out pollination. And for those of us that need a little bit of a refresher, pollination is when an animal visits a flower and they're collecting pollen grains, which are a part of the male part of the plant. And as they fly over to another flower, they're depositing some of those pollen grains onto the female part of the plant. And this allows the plant to reproduce. And when plants reproduce, that's when we see things like nuts and seeds and berries come up on the landscape. And so having these cross-pollination services going on also helps to maintain diverse plant communities. And that can help with nutrient cycling in the soil. It can help with soil stability or erosion prevention. The roots are helping with water filtration. The plants are soaking up carbon out of the atmosphere. And not only are the plants themselves helping to maintain this environment, but they're also providing food as well as nesting resources for a lot of different animals that live in these natural areas. And so Xerces had the opportunity to partner with Whole Foods a few years back. And what they did is they took a photo of just your typical produce section, and then they removed everything that's bee pollinated in that photo. And so what you would see without bees on the landscape is something like this, right? So we wouldn't completely starve, but we would definitely lose a lot of that color and nutrition that we all have become accustomed to in our regular diets. And so for all of those reasons is why we consider pollinators to be a keystone species. And a keystone species is an organism that has a drastically large role in its environment. So if we were to think about removing bees from the ecosystem, we would see a huge shift, right? It wouldn't function in the way that we're used to, because 85% of flowering plants require an animal to deliver those pollination services. And most of the time, that's an insect. So the main groups of our insect pollinators include butterflies, flies, moths, wasps, beetles, and bees. But the bees are the most effective pollinator, and that's for a few different reasons. The first one is that bees are the only insect to actually consume nectar and pollen as both larvae and adults. So all throughout their life, bees are constantly needing resources from flowers, right? So they're always visiting flowers, they're always delivering those pollination services. And because of that, they've all adapted these really specialized characteristics to collect and transport a whole bunch of pollen at once. So if you look at this bee's hind leg hair, you can see that it's made up of a dense amount of hairs there. And those hairs actually act as like a comb that collect pollen grains. And so some bees will have them on their hind legs, some will have them on their stomachs. Bumblebees have it on their hind leg as well, but it's called a corbicula. So instead of having a whole bunch of hairs, what we see is more of a basket. So this section on their leg is sort of a groove, and they can put a whole bunch of pollen grains in there at once and transport it. And when it's full, it might look something like this. That bee has a whole bunch of pollen just packed on her hind leg there. And the last thing that makes bees the most effective pollinator is that they display what's called flower constancy. So when a bee leaves her nest to go out and collect nectar and pollen, on that single foraging trip, she's going to tend to stay on the same type of flower. So if she leaves her nest and is presented with a field of daisies and mint flowers and roses, she's going to stay on that rose, fly to another rose, and fly to another rose. And that really ensures that cross-pollination for the flowers happens, right? Because the rose needs rose pollen. And the bees and the flowers have sort of figured out the system that they need each other. So the bees are going to visit the rose and deliver that rose pollen to another rose. But when most of us think of a bee, we typically go for a honeybee right off the bat, right? Because it's an object of familiarity for us. They're a very large part of our agricultural system. But it's not what we're going to be focusing on today. So we're going to start with a poll here. Rich, if you want to launch that. How many different species of wild native bees do you think there are in the United States? Less than 100, 500 to 1,000, 2,000, 4,000, or more than 5,000? Give it a few more seconds.
We're at about 80% participation and everything's
Okay.
stabilized there, Katie.
Perfect. I can't see that, so I'm going to go forward. So those of you who guessed 2,000 to 4,000 are correct. There's about 3,600 species. So there's the results. Yep, so it looks like most of you, about half of you got that. And when we look at wild bee diversity, that's my mouth here. There we go. There's actually about 20,000 different species found worldwide and about 5,200 in North America. And when we jump down to just the United States and Canada, we see about 3,600 different species of wild bees. And you can see that just from these 5 pictures here, they can look vastly different from one another, right? We have really small bees that have almost no hair. We have very large bees that are almost covered in hair. Some bees have really short tongues, some have really long tongues. So here's a small carpenter bee that's a very deep metallic cobalt blue color that a lot of you may have seen, or you probably will see if you go out and look. This is a bee that likes to nest in little pithy stems. So if you find a blackberry bush or rose bushes, you might find some of these bees nesting in there. Then we also have sweat bees, which a lot of people have heard of. These are really, really tiny bees. All of those little pink dots that you're seeing on her hind legs are pollen grains that she's collected. And then we also have the large, it's not that working. My PowerPoint has stalled for a second. Oh, there we go. Large fuzzy bumblebees. So our bees can look very different from each other, and they have all different types of behaviors and nesting strategies. And we are going to largely focus on bumblebees here. My PowerPoint is stalling. Sorry about that. We're going to be focusing on bumblebees, but when you talk about wild bees, like these are the species that you're going to see carrying out the pollination services for a lot of our native plants, right? So in agricultural systems is where you see the honeybees being trucked around, but when you think about a natural environment, most of those services are being carried out by wild bees that already exist there. And so we're focusing on bumblebees because they are very charismatic species, right? Most of us can recognize a bumblebee, whether it's by sight, they're very large and fuzzy, make a very loud buzz. You can generally pick out a bumblebee. They're also a generalist species. So just like there are birds associated with wetlands or woodlands, there's also bees that are associated with wetlands and woodlands. But for bumblebees, they're going to be found in all different types of habitat. And they're going to be foraging on all different types of plants. So we have a better chance of picking up bumblebee data when we all go out looking. The next thing is that bumblebees have a very long active season. So some of our other wild bees may only be out for 4 to 6 weeks, but bumblebees can be out from early April, depending on the year, sometimes all the way through October, if there are enough resources and the weather conditions are right. And we also know that bumblebees are an imperiled group of organisms, right? There's been a lot of research and people gathering data on bumblebees for quite some time now. So we've been able to detect a decline in many of these species. And so when we look at the value of bumblebees, they've got a very unique physiology about them that allows them to fly in some harsher conditions than other wild bees. They're a very intelligent species. They're what we consider a long-tongue bee versus a short-tongue bee. And they're also a very innovative species. So as we look through bees, bumblebees can exhibit what we call muscular thermogenesis, which is a fancy word for saying they can generate a lot of heat by vibrating their muscles in their thorax, which is the middle part of the body where the wings attach and all the legs attach. You can imagine that if there are muscles anywhere in that insect's bodies, it's right there in the thorax. And what they're able to do is shiver those muscles so much that they generate heat that allows them to fly in colder conditions, so they can be active earlier in the day and later in the day, sometimes in wetter conditions, and some of our other wild bees may not be able to. And as I mentioned, bumblebees are considered a long-tongue bee. So this allows them to reach back into some flowers that have longer spurs or have tubes like Monarda or bee balm. Some of your lupins or baptisia plants that the bees have to pry open, bumblebees are able to stick their tongue all the way back into those flowers, whereas some of our other smaller wild bees have short tongues and can't reach the resources back there. And when we talk about innovation of a bumblebee, they are again able to use those large muscles that they have to carry out what's called buzz pollination. So here we might have a tomato flower, and what the bee is doing is she's inverting herself on that flower and gripping on with her mandibles. And as she vibrates her muscles, that vibration travels up through her head, out to the mandibles, and vigorously shakes that flower that dislodges pollen grains. And those pollen grains then fall from the flower onto the bee, and she's able to collect them and carry them home. And that also pollinates the flower. And so this active buzz pollination is helpful for about 8% of plants, and that can be for tomatoes or peppers or blueberries. And so that's why if you've ever heard of greenhouses using bumblebee colonies instead of honeybee colonies, it's because bumblebees can carry out the service to more effectively pollinate a crop like tomatoes or peppers. So here's a little GIF of a bumblebee doing buzz pollination. You can see that little white stuff. Those are all very small pollen grains coming out of the male part of the flower. And then we have this really neat video showing bumblebee intelligence. So here what they're going to do is train bumblebees, and it shows that the bumblebees are actually able to learn and retain information. So they're going to show the bumblebee, hey, if you move this little ball to the center here and get it inside this yellow circle, we will reward you with some nectar. So the bumblebee figures that out, gets her little drink of nectar, and then she actually moves the ball to the center all by herself. She's like, hey, if I do this, maybe I'll get another sweet treat. And then in this clip here, she's actually showing her friend that they can do that. So not only are they able to learn, but they're able to share what they're learning. And then they can also sort of do geometry to figure out the most effective way. So she's going to choose the ball that's closest to the center to get her reward, right? Because why waste time? So we're dealing with a very intelligent species here. And hopefully that's enough to get you excited to want to go out and look for bumblebees in the state. And so the way that the atlas is going to work is it's sort of a divide and conquer design. And so what we've done is split Missouri up into 75 different grid cells. And the idea is that as you sign up for the project, you are going to select whichever grid cell you like, whether that be one near your home or one where maybe you go to visit a sibling or something in some other part of the state. And so you're going to adopt a grid cell, and then you are responsible for surveying that grid cell. And you need to carry out 2 surveys anytime between June and September. And then you submit whatever data you find from that survey. And I know this is very broad right now, but we're going to get into the details of it. And tomorrow we'll show you all the tiny things that you need to know that will give you the different skills and the confidence to go out and complete these surveys. And so once we've collected all of the data from everybody going out and running surveys, it's going to really help us improve the understanding of bumblebees in the state. And we know that this community science take on it works because we have an atlas project in the Pacific Northwest that includes Idaho, Oregon, and Washington. And we also have the atlas in Nebraska. And so what these atlas projects are doing is establishing a baseline data set, which is very basic information like what species are you seeing, where are you, what's the date, what are they foraging on? And all of that simple information allows us to sort of monitor population changes, to see how big some of these populations are, if they've changed when we look at historical data that may have been collected. It allows us to monitor the distribution of species and see how widespread some of the different species are in the state. And it also allows us to fill in knowledge regarding habitat associations. So after you go out and run your bumblebee survey, we ask you to do a really quick habitat survey that just captures a snapshot of the land around you. And so this information allows us to pick up on things like habitat preferences as far as nesting goes or foraging. What are the bees picking up on the landscape that's important? And that information helps us to form evidence-based recommendations, right? Things that are going to help land managers, conservation practitioners, policymakers, people that are really helping to get conservation on the ground, right? Put in some nice habitat, put in something that's effective for pollinators. So when we look at some of the outcomes from the Pacific Northwest Bumble Bee Atlas, from 2018 to now, they've collected about 14,000 observations of bumblebees, and they've found 24 different species out there. And in addition to that, they found more than 300 species of greatest conservation need. And that will make sense after Rich gives his little spiel on conservation status. But essentially what that means is that these species of greatest conservation need are bees that we know have experienced a really, really bad decline, right? We know that their populations are declining, they're not doing good. And so by having a whole bunch of volunteers spread out and look in different areas, we have a greater chance of detecting these species, which is really important for us to be aware of. And not only is it good for the bees, but when we sent out a survey to the Pacific Northwest, volunteers in the Atlas Project have had a very valuable experience and found that they learned a lot through this project. And after their first year of surveying, they were asked if they were going to come back for a second year of surveying. And you can see that the majority of them were going to return. So to sign up, the way that this is going to work, and again, the details are all going to come tomorrow, but in short, you go online to MissouriBumbleBeeAtlas.org, you adopt your grid cell, and then after you've completed this training and tomorrow's training, that'll help you learn the protocol. If you forget something, you can go online to where you'll find the recordings of these videos, as well as the handbook, the bumblebee data sheets, the habitat data sheets, the ID sheets, anything that might help you is all online. And then once you feel confident enough and ready, you can go out to your grid cell and complete your surveys. And once you're done with that, then you submit the data. And when you submit your data, the bumblebees will go through a site called Bumblebee Watch. And Bumblebee Watch is a larger community science project in the United States and Canada, where people submit photo observations of bees, and then somebody like myself or Rich will go through and verify to see what species were actually found. And there's also a mobile app. So we're just curious to see how many of you have actually used Bumblebee Watch already. Okay, can't see what's happening, but I'm guessing
You're about
most of you
90% and it's leveled up.
Okay. Well, I didn't see it, but I'm sure the results will pop up. Oh, there it is. No, but I will start. Okay, so it looks like a few of you have used it and half of you are ready to start using it, so that's a good sign. We have another stall from the PowerPoint side. There we go. So here's an example of Bumblebee Watch. So this is kind of showcasing the Nebraska Bumblebee Atlas, which was launched in 2019. So if you look at the image on the left in 2018, you can see that it was pretty sparse. But once people actually started looking for bumblebees and submitting their observations, up to date, we're up to about 1,500 new observations for the state of Nebraska. You can kind of see that that map was filled in there. And so we're hoping that the same thing is going to come to Missouri with this project. So to date, there are about 120 observations in Missouri. But we're really hoping that that's going to increase here. We've got 1 month left of the survey season and then a whole season next year. So if any of you are very eager to go out and start your bumblebee surveys, you can sign on and adopt your grid cell. Again, tomorrow we're going to go over the details of surveying and collecting and submitting data. And you can survey until the end of September this year. Otherwise, the survey season will start next June and carry out through September. And so with that, I think we can field a couple of questions while Rich and I sort of switch roles here.
Yeah, there's three questions here, Katie, that have popped up. One of them is, the question says, so if you have a highly diverse field, and I assume that means field of flowers, the individual bees concentrate on different flower species, and this came after your slide about flower constancy.
Will you say that one more time?
If you have
Or
a
is it a
highly
question?
diverse field of flowers, do different individual bees concentrate on different flower species?
So with bees, well, a species like bumblebees, they're social. So when one of them finds a really good resource, they'll typically tell their friends about it and say, hey, I found this really good group of flowers here. And a lot of them will go out and forage on that type of flower until they feel like they've used up the resource there, and then they'll fly to another type.
Another question here, comparing carpenter bees and bumblebees. What is the functional difference, other than their life cycle, or other than reproduction, the question says, between bumblebees and carpenter bees?
There's quite a few differences. They look very similar for sure. That'll definitely be a species that many people will probably submit thinking that it's a bumblebee. But carpenter bees are more of a solitary species, so they don't have a colony. There's usually one female who does all of the work, lays her eggs. Yeah, just very, very different bees, even though they look similar.
Last question. Is each species of bumblebee active throughout April to October, or are different species active at different times of the season?
Different species are going to be active at different times. So there's going to be species that will emerge earlier than others, and there's going to be some that will be active later in the season than others. But when we're looking in that July, August period, you're still going to see most of the different species out all at once.
And another question just popped up here. I see bumblebees at my hummingbird feeders. If so, would you capture that as data?
Yes, so you can take a photo of that and submit it, and that would be what we would call an incidental observation, unless you're doing a survey in your backyard. But you can definitely submit photos of that.
Another question about carpenter bees. Do carpenter bees chase away bumblebees from flowers when the flower is very attractive?
I'm not exactly sure on that, but what you might be listening to or observing is a territorial behavior of the males. So a lot of times male carpenter bees and some of our male bumblebees will perch on top of a flower that's near a nest, and they're waiting for the female bumblebees to emerge out of the nest. And so if another male carpenter bee comes into that area, they'll generally fly at each other, but your male bees are harmless, so they can't sting you. So there might be a bee that flies at you during this, but they're harmless. They're just trying to look mean.
And another question about, about different times of year. It says some bumblebees are active until November in St. Louis. Why stop surveying in September?
So we're just trying to keep it consistent. So we want everybody out looking at the same time. So the peak of bumblebee workers that you're going to see are going to be out between June and September. And at the tail end, so in like April, May, you're going to see your queens emerging. and you're going to see a lot of males towards the end of the season. So we're really focusing on just the center peak active season of bumblebees. So you can still capture those bees that you see out in November and take photos and submit them, but it won't be part of an official survey.
Yeah, the other thing that I would add to that, Katie, is just the purpose of this project is to do equal effort surveys in the middle of the bumblebee field season. And so our goal is to document which species are present where throughout the state of Missouri. And if we do a survey in November, you will get a very biased survey towards only those species that are present in November, as opposed to the center of the season when you're going to capture all possible species that would be present at that site. And so we want to, during our surveys, which will be equal effort and compared across sites, we want to make sure we're surveying at about the same time of year. All right, great question here. One of my favorite bee behaviors. I am growing pumpkins and have seen 7 to 9 bumblebees all on top of each other inside of one flower. Is this typical?
You said that's your favorite question. Go for it.
Well, it's hard to say what's happening there, but this time of year, the male bumblebees are starting to emerge, and males often don't return to the nest, or usually don't return to the nest in the evening time. They usually spend the night somewhere out in the environment. And squash flowers open and close each day, so squash flowers make a great place to have a little refuge or a great house. And so sometimes you will find squash or bumblebees sleeping inside, multiple male bumblebees sleeping inside of squash flowers. It's also possible that squash flower is just particularly attractive, and there isn't a whole lot of other resources around, so there's a bunch of bees in there trying to get those resources. They do have a lot of resources. So yeah, great observation. I had seen another question pop up, but
I answered a couple of them.
Oh, you did? Great.
Yeah.
Yeah, so you will find bumblebees sleeping. They often sleep on the underside of leaves. You'll find them sort of just hanging out there or on stems, especially if you have like a big bloom area of Joe Pye weed. If you go out there in the morning time before it warms up, there's a good chance you're going to find 5 or so male bumblebees just hanging out, sleeping, holding onto the vegetation somewhere. Another good question here. I see more bumblebees earlier in the season. Are we late to start compared to other states? Yes, I mean, ideally we would have launched this project in June. But just the logistics of launching the project, and by the time the partnerships and funding came together, this was the best time for us to start. And this is really, we're looking at this year, 2021, as a pilot to get started, to get people trained, to get people excited, but then to fully do a whole survey season in 2021. Starting in June and doing the entire season. And this is what we did in Nebraska last year as well. We started last year around this time in Nebraska, did half a season, and then a full season in 2020.
There's one on here about finding bumblebee nests under the sidewalk or under rock stairs. Is there any unique value in monitoring them? And there's a section on Bumblebee Watch where you can submit photos of bumblebee nests, and that is a great way for us to just know that they're there and identify what species it is.
Yeah, I would just add to that by saying that it's pretty incredible how little we know about bumblebee nesting. When you think about how well studied bumblebees are, we actually don't know that much about where they nest. So filling out the nesting form on Bumblebee Watch really helps us learn about which sites and the surrounding area that's important for nesting behavior. So that's really important. There's a question here about which plants are attractive in the springtime. I would just encourage you to go to the training packet there. If you click on that link, the last link I shared in the chat there, on that page, there's if you scroll down a little bit, you'll see a flower resource guide for pollinators in the state of Missouri or in the Midwest. And that has bloom times, bloom colors, and the Xerces Society website also has a ton of resources. I imagine, Bill, that also the Missouri Department of Conservation has plant recommendation guides that you could share. And those are probably also linked in the participation handbook that I sent a link out to earlier. There's lots of flower resources available.
And another resource you might look into is grownative.org. They've got some top 10 lists for bees, top 10 lists for butterflies, and a lot of pollinator information related to plants. That's grownative.org.
There's another site, the Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center, which is based in Texas. They have an enormous database of wildflowers, and we partnered with them several years ago now to go through, and we marked all of the flowers that are special value to butterflies and pollinators, and you can actually search that way. So that's another source, Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center. And they also, from each species of plant, they also link to seed providers. So it's another resource that I would recommend. There's a question here about how to encourage bumblebees to nest in urban yards in St. Louis City. I assume that's bumblebees, and that's a typo, but that's a cute name. The best thing that you can do to encourage bumblebees to nest in your yard is to just be lazy, to leave overgrown areas, rock piles and fence posts and downed wood, or all areas that would encourage the type of areas that bumblebees like to nest. You can also put out artificial domiciles. There's plans out there for creating like nest boxes to put out. I've had very little success with those, and I don't know many people that have had much success, but they're great features to have at a house. They create conversations around bee conservation for people that visit your home, and they're great educational pieces, even if they don't, if you don't get a bumblebee to nest in them. I will say that in parts of the country, though, that people have found that snakes like them. So if you're not a big snake fan, you may want to avoid putting those bumblebee nest boxes out in your yard. Just beware when you open them that there may be a snake inside. All right, I am going to go ahead and get started with part 2 of the webinar here. Katie, will you just confirm to me that you can see my screen, please?
You're good.
Okay, great. So thanks, Katie, for that introduction to why we conduct these Bumblebee Atlas projects and why moving into Missouri is an important next step for us. I'm now just going to dive a little bit deeper into bumblebee ecology and conservation to put some of what Katie talked about in context, so that we can learn a little bit more about why we're doing this project, and then just also so we can learn a little bit more as a group about the animals which we will be surveying. So bumblebee ecology, quick little overview here, and then we'll jump into the conservation status. So we're going to start with a poll, which is a pretty simple question. We talked about how many species of native wild bees there are in North America, dialing down for all those around 4,000 species that we talked about earlier. How many bumblebees are there in the United States? How many species of bumblebee are there in the United States?
Rich, I don't have the ability to launch the question.
Oh, well, that makes it harder, doesn't it? I think I can still do it. Let's see.
Okay.
There we go. Yep. So 20 to 30, 40 to 50, 50 to 60, 60 to 70. Looks like the results are slowing down here. And we're dealing with a pretty well-educated group. So most of you said that there was between 40 and 50 species in North America, or in the United States rather. And that is correct, although the way that the question's phrased, I think that's still true. There are between 40 and 50 in the United States. We have 47 written here, although I think some of those species may only be up in far northern Canada, so it may be less than that in the United States. But yeah, 40 to 50 species here in the United States is what we're dealing with. And in Missouri, we're probably closer to 10 to 12 species. And we will introduce you to those species tomorrow when we go through how to identify the bumblebees in Missouri. When we look at the diversity in North America, you can see that there are around 47 species, and the biggest diversity we find is in the western coastal and mountainous regions. So in a place like Oregon, where in a space of around 100 miles, we can go from a coastal rainforest type habitat to a valley, prairie, grassland type habitat to alpine area to high desert in the course of around 100 linear miles. There are just a lot of different habitat types, and bumblebees are adapted to all of those habitat types. So we've gotten some pretty diverse speciation in the mountainous West. There are less species in the eastern United States, but still 10 species. And the benefit to having 10 to 12 species versus 27 to 30, as we have here in the Pacific Northwest, is that it's pretty easy to become familiar with most of them and learn how to identify most of them. All of these bumblebee species, for the most part, are social colonies that are founded by a single queen. And the queen, we're going to go over the life cycle in detail in a minute, but the queen emerges in the spring. She builds up her nest, and then in the fall, she switches to producing new queens and males, the reproductive members of the colony. And then at the final end of the season, most of the colony dies. The workers and the founder's queen dies, and only the new queens that have hopefully mated are the ones to survive. They hibernate the winter, and then they will emerge the next year and start a new nest. They have an annual life cycle, which is quite different than, say, honeybees, which have a perennial life cycle and make honey during the summertime so that they have food to eat in the wintertime. Colonies, depending on the species, the habitat type, and the resources available, can be quite small, from 25 workers to quite large, over 500 and even over 1,000 workers in some cases. And as we discussed during the question and answer period at the beginning or after Katie's presentation, nests are, we don't know a whole lot about where they nest, but we're learning more. But what we do know suggests that abandoned rodent burrows are one of the most important areas. So they tend to nest underground in these abandoned rodent burrows. And part of the reason is it seems that bumblebees need some pre-existing insulation upon which to build their nests. So they need some sort of structure. And because rodents tend to be pack rats and put a lot of things in their nests, it makes a great place for bumblebees to start building the structure of their nests. You can see that their nests are unkempt. They're not nice and even like what we see in a honeybee comb. They're just a series of waxen pots that the queen builds and fills with pollen and nectar and then lays her eggs. What you see here in the lower right-hand corner of the screen, that is one of these waxen pots that the queen has filled with pollen and nectar mixed together into sort of that paste that they keep on their legs. And then she'll lay several eggs in each one of those. So those white things that you see there are the eggs that the queen has laid. Other areas that seem to be important for nesting, there are some species of bumblebee. Bombus fervidus is one of them that lives in your neck of the woods, that just nests on the surface of the ground. It can be right underneath some bunch grasses in the prairie, right on the surface of the ground. The American bumblebee, Bombus pennsylvanicus, also just nests on the surface of the ground occasionally. And as I mentioned, if you're looking to encourage bumblebees to nest near you, these unmowed areas, just sort of leaving an unkempt area, thatched grasses are great, rock walls. And so there are some species that nest above ground, and abandoned bird boxes are a great place that sometimes you'll find some species nesting in. So here's a linear picture of the bumblebee life cycle, starting with the winter or sort of early spring here on the far left, and late fall or early winter here on the far right. It's important, and Katie covered this when she answered some of your questions in between our two modules here, that when we say early spring and late fall, this isn't true for all species. There are some species that are quite early emerging, and there are other species that emerge much later. So some species might emerge in March or April, and there are other species that might not emerge until June. And so when those species begin and when they end their life cycle is dependent on that species and the resources available. So this is just sort of a generalized diagram of what the life cycle looks like, but the timing will obviously differ by species and in a habitat. But generally speaking, the queen emerges from her hibernacula, and the hibernacula is often, and this is a part of the bumblebee life cycle that we know almost nothing about, which is actually amazing because, as I mentioned earlier, bumblebees are incredibly well-studied organisms, but we don't know where they spend the wintertime. We don't know where they hibernate for the most part. But that, if you think about it, that's about half of where bumblebees spend their life. So half of the year, bumblebees are in an area that we know very little about. And so learning more about their overwintering habits and where we find them could be an incredibly important key to the conservation of this group of animals. It's hard to conserve an animal if you don't even know where it spends half of its life. But we do know that they emerge from these hibernacula, which tend to be really shallow holes in the ground sometime in the spring. And it may be in early spring or late spring, depending on the species. She will fly around the landscape, sometimes taking a couple weeks to do so, and trying to find a place to build her nest. Once she finds that place that she's going to build her nest, she starts building waxen pots, and then she will forage on the landscape for pollen and nectar, and bring pollen and nectar back to the nest. And she fills these waxen pots with the pollen and nectar and lays her eggs on that pollen and nectar in those waxen pots. She then spends the next 5 or so weeks just incubating those eggs. It takes about 5 weeks from the period of laying the egg to emerging as a winged adult. And bumblebees are a lot like a butterfly, and that they emerge as sort of a caterpillar or a worm-like animal, and they spend a fair bit of time in that worm-like state, or go through several what we call instars in the entomology world. And then they go through complete metamorphosis, and you can see some of that at the bottom diagram in the center here. You can see sort of the worms and then the pupae in this here. So it's about 5 weeks from egg laying until the workers then emerge as winged adults. And the workers, once the workers emerge, the queen no longer leaves the nest. She spends the rest of the summer, or the foundress queen no longer leaves the nest. She spends the rest of the summer laying eggs, building waxen pots, and tending to her young. She also spends probably a fair bit of time preventing her daughters from trying to lay eggs. So all worker bees are females, and they have the ability to also lay eggs, although they won't be fertilized eggs. Bumblebees and other members of the Hymenoptera actually have a complex genetic system called haplodiploidy, or single loci sex determination. And so a fertilized egg actually develops into a female, and an unfertilized egg, in other words, an egg that doesn't have sperm with it, develops into a male. So her daughters, the foundress queen's daughters, are actually able to lay eggs that would develop into males. And that can and does happen in many colonies. But anyway, the queen doesn't leave her nest after the workers, and the workers are then bringing resources and more resources into the nest. And as that happens and time goes on, the nest starts to get bigger and bigger with more casts or with more individuals that become workers. Once the resources are large enough in the colony, the queen will switch to producing the reproductive members of the colony. She'll reproduce, or she'll generate the new queens that will become next year's queens, and then also males. And the males and the queens will hopefully find each other on flowers or on the ground or sometimes in midair, and they mate with each other. It's generally females only mate with a single individual, although there are exceptions, and it has been noted that sometimes they mate with multiple males. And then after the new queen has mated, she will return to the nest and continue to benefit from the resources brought in by the colony. The males do not return to the nest. They, as we talked about, spend their night out on vegetation, flying around looking for potentially additional mates. And then as the season moves on, the queen continues to forage to build up her fat reserves, and the rest of the colony, including the foundress queen, dies. And then at the very end of the season, when resources are no longer available, the newly mated queen will find a place to dig a new hibernacula where she will then overwinter. And this is a long tale to go over the life cycle, which is somewhat complex. But there are really a couple of important take-home messages here from a conservation perspective, which is that the life cycle here is quite long. They need a solid 12 to 16 to 25 weeks to really go through the complete life cycle until this foundress queen has produced her new queens, and those new queens have mated and found their way into their hibernacula. The colony has not actually reproduced. So if some management action were to happen in the late fall when the queen was trying to build up her fat reserves, that could impact her ability to survive the winter. Likewise, if we're mowing down prairies or flowering resources in the middle of the season when they're trying to build up their colony size, that can also affect the colony. And having those early season resources available when queens emerge so that they can immediately find pollen and nectar to start their nest is really important. So having flowering resources on the landscape for a long period of time is very, very important, and one of the ways that bumblebee populations have probably been impacted over the last 50 years with some of the habitat change that we've seen. There's also a really cool part of the bumblebee life cycle, or a few species that are non-social. They are essentially parasitic, and these are what we call the cuckoo bumblebees. And there are several species in the eastern United States and Missouri, some that are generalists like Bombus citrinus, and some that are specialists that have learned to only, or have only been found reproducing in the nest of a couple of species. And Bombus variabilis is one of those, which specialize is in the nests of Bombus pennsylvanicus. And so they are what we call cuckoo bees, which are just like cuckoo birds. They emerge typically later than some of than our true or our social bumblebees. And they have to fly around and find one of their nests. And once they find the nest, they try to enter the nest, and they will usually kill the foundress queen and take over that nest. But it's kind of a touchy situation because she has to find a nest that is further along, far enough along in its life cycle such that it has worker bees to continue to bring resources into the nest, because she doesn't produce any workers. All of her offspring will be reproductive members, reproductive females or males. But if she invades this nest too late, then those workers and the queen may be able to repel her and prevent her from taking over the nest. So there's a really delicate period of time in the spring when the cuckoo bumblebees have to find a nest in order to reproduce. But anyway, this is a really fascinating aspect of bumblebee ecology that that is fun to look at. And the cuckoo bumblebees are fun to find in the spring and in the fall. So that's a really quick overview of our understanding of bumblebee ecology and conservation. And it's important to recognize that, you know, I could probably teach a whole webinar on bumblebee ecology and conservation that would be much longer than this. But this is just a really quick overview so that you can have some understanding of the animals that we're trying to survey, and then also understand why we're targeting that middle of the season, right? So we're trying to get out there in June through September when the worker bees are out and of most species. I'm now going to dive a little bit into the status of bumblebees, or our understanding of the status of bumblebees in North America. And that conservation tale, or the decline of bumblebee tale, begins in the mid-1990s. There's a gentleman by the name of Robin Thorpe, who was a professor and then professor emeritus at UC Davis, the University of California at Davis. And at that time, in the mid-1990s, he was monitoring a number of sites in Southern Oregon and Northern California. And throughout the course of that study, in a few short years, 2 species completely disappeared from his field sites. The Western bumblebee and Franklin's bumblebee went from being some of the most abundant bees in his surveys to completely disappearing. And at that time, he raised the red flag and said, sort of across the bumblebee conservation community, hey, I'm noticing some pretty serious declines in bumblebees here in the Western United States. What are you all noticing out there? And sure enough, people started looking deeper into it and found that the yellow-banded bumblebee and the rusty-patched bumblebee, both are which native to the Eastern United States, were also in pretty severe decline. And we're still trying to understand the causes of these declines, but all 4 of these animals have been petitioned for endangered species listing. The Western bumblebee petition is being considered by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service right now, and a decision is due in 2023. Franklin's bumblebee was petitioned close to a decade ago. Just this past year, the Fish and Wildlife Service finally finished their review and determined that Franklin's bumblebee was warranted of an endangered species listing. And the final ruling is due out on that species sometimes before the end of the calendar year. So it will be listed as an endangered species before 2020 is up. The yellow-banded bumblebee, Bombus terricola, was petitioned, and it was reviewed by the Fish and Wildlife Service, and they determined that endangered species status was not warranted for this species, despite the fact that it's undergone pretty severe declines. The rusty-patched bumblebee was petitioned, and it was listed for endangered species as an endangered species in 2017. And it's important to recognize that of these 4 species, the rusty-patched bumblebee has a range which potentially overlaps with part of Missouri. So when you review the handbook and go to complete your surveys, it's important to just know that this species is endangered. And we obviously want to do surveys to try to find this species, and that's the most important thing. But if we do find it, there are some important considerations, and we'll try to go over those tomorrow when we talk about the project. From the finding that those 4 species were in decline, the Xerces Society partnered with a bunch of scientists all over the world to form the Bumblebee Specialist Group, which is part of the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, or the IUCN. And the task of the IUCN Bumblebee Specialist Group is for us to assess the extinction risk of all of the bumblebees in the world. And I am actually the red list authority for the IUCN Bumblebee Specialist Group, which means my task is to actually take the data for these species and run them through the calculators that the IUCN has and find out which species are doing well and which ones are struggling. And we have now finished the analysis of the bumblebees in the New World. So the bumblebees of North America, Mesoamerica, and South America have been assessed. and we're now starting to work on the bumblebees in the rest of the area. And all of the areas that you see on this map that are colored and not gray have native bumblebees. The gray areas that you see here are parts of the globe where there are no species of bumblebees. Native species. Australia and New Zealand have had a couple of species that have been introduced. Our analysis from North America found that around a quarter of the species in North America are facing some degree of extinction risk. So some of that are those 4 species that I talked about earlier, but there are a number of other species as well that are of conservation concern. And in the central United States, there are 9 bumblebees that are on this IUCN list of vulnerable species that are in one of the threatened categories. Bombus affinis, so the rusty patch bumblebee, the suckly cuckoo bumblebee, the variable cuckoo bumblebee, the southern plains bumblebee, the yellow bumblebee, Morrison's bumblebee, the western bumblebee, the American bumblebee, and the yellow-banded bumblebee are all species in the eastern United States that are of conservation concern. And in Missouri, there are 5 of those species that could or are likely or once upon a time found. So the rusty patch bumblebee is a species that, as I mentioned, is on the endangered species list and is certainly of conservation concern. And the other species that we could potentially detect in Missouri are the variable cuckoo bumblebee, Bombus variabilis, Bombus fraternus, the southern plains bumblebee, the yellow bumblebee, Bombus fervidus, and the American bumblebee, Bombus pennsylvanicus. So these are species that we particularly are interested in. How do we need to learn more about these species and the habitats that they need. Because one of the things that we don't really get into too much about habitat creation in these webinars, but one of the things that I think about a lot at Xerces is we're spending a lot of time creating habitat for pollinators. And my fear is that some of the habitat that we're creating is just going to make our common bees more common. What I want to do is use evidence about which habitats that these endangered species or these imperiled species are using to inform our evidence-based habitat recommendations so that we can create habitat that's going to support and help some of these imperiled species recover and not just help common species stay common. So when people see these lists of bumblebees, they're often asked me, what is it? Why is it that bumblebees are in decline? Why are we losing so many species? Or we haven't lost any species, but why are some species in decline? And the short answer is that there's no silver bullet here. There's no single thing that is causing bumblebees to be in decline. There are a lot of factors that are contributing, and the interaction of those factors is probably the most significant of all. So I mentioned a little bit earlier the unique genetics of bumblebees and their sex determination. I'm not going to get into a genetic lecture and why that is important for conservation, but their unique genetic makeup makes them uniquely susceptible to what we call inbreeding depression. So they're more likely to if they're mating with closely related individuals, they're more likely to enter into a period where they're going to have serious effects on their ability to reproduce. Pesticides are also a major factor on the landscape. And then food supply, and this can mean a lot of different things. The changing of resources and when they're available, which resources are available, what time of year they're available. And then obviously climate change is another factor that's overarching with all of these and impacting how they interact with each other. So just going through these in a little bit more detail, what we've done in North America in a lot of areas is we've taken grasslands and prairies that once upon a time looked like this, and they would flower from early spring until late fall, providing the flower resources that are needed, as you now know, for the bumblebee life cycle for that entire time period. And we've taken a lot of those grasslands and prairies and we've converted them into agricultural lands. And it is true that agricultural lands sometimes do provide abundant flowering resources, but those flowering resources are usually only available for 2 to 3, maybe 4 weeks during the period of a season. So that is not long enough to support the life cycle of a bumblebee colony. Additionally, we're taking edges of cities, brown fields, and other areas, and we're plowing them under to create more habitats for people to live. And unfortunately, many people are taking their individual habitats and they're converting them to lawns or impervious surfaces. And unfortunately, lawns are really not great habitat for almost any animal. They really don't support almost any native animal. Doesn't feed or live in lawns. They're not really providing habitat. So that's created a huge habitat loss throughout North America. Additionally, obviously, a street or a parking area is not going to create habitat either, although you can create median strips within these areas that can provide habitat, and more organizations are starting to do this, which is fantastic. On top of habitat loss, we have a pesticide problem in this country, and we have for a very long time. The figure that you see here is the increased usage of a systemic insecticide called imidacloprid. And imidacloprid is a neonicotinoid, which is what we call a systemic insecticide. And systemic means that you can apply it once to the plant, and it is absorbed by the plant tissue and then expressed in every single part of the plant. So it's in the leaves, it's in the stems, but most importantly for bees, it's also in the flowers, and not just the petals, but also in the pollen and in the nectar. So when bees fly around and collect the pollen and nectar that they need to eat themselves, and also to lay their eggs on and to feed their young, each bite that they take of pollen from a plant that's been treated has a sublethal dose of that systemic insecticide. And so it may not kill the bee on the spot, although it can. More likely, what's going to happen is over time, the young are going to feed on pollen that has these insecticides in it. And what we've learned is that these sublethal doses affect the ability of bees to forage. It reduces the amount of pollen they bring back to the nest when they're eating this tainted food. It increases the foraging bouts, so they're out for longer and bring fewer resources back. And it also reduces their ability to reproduce. So these insecticides are broadly used throughout much of the country. I'm sure you can find Missouri on that map, and you realize that by 2012, much of the state is covered, or much of the counties in the state at least, are having pretty high usage of these systemic insecticides. And it's important to mention that this is only agricultural use, and this is only one of the 4 highly toxic neonicotinoid insecticides that are available on the product, on the market. So there are 3 others that are available and are also widely and increasingly used throughout agricultural systems. Unfortunately, this is not just a problem in agricultural areas. We find that when we look at water in urban and suburban areas, that the concentration of neonicotinoids in the water in these suburban and urban areas is often higher than it is in agricultural areas. And this is largely because these products are widely available and can be bought from almost any home improvement store. In fact, they're often, or at least sometimes, the only products that are available at these stores. And homeowners don't have to take pesticide application classes to use these. And so they often just over apply them. Although sometimes we find that even those with applicator licenses do misapply these products. What you see here, this is a parking lot outside of Portland, Oregon, and this is a European linden tree or a tilia tree that produce thousands of blooms in the middle of June. So at the peak of colony season, these are incredibly important nectar and pollen resources for bumblebees. And in this case, a pesticide application company came and they treated this tree for aphids with a highly toxic neonicotinoid insecticide. And this caused an incredible lethal dose of this insecticide to the bumblebees that were foraging on the 67 trees that were in this parking lot. So here you see a parking space filled with bumblebee carcasses that was repeated across, 67 different trees in this single parking lot had been treated on this day. So 100, likely over 100,000 bumblebees died because of this application. And this is continuing to happen. These chemicals are also used in these ornamental settings where they really have no use whatsoever. So it's not just agricultural areas that are affecting, that are using these insecticides, it's really everywhere. And at Xerces, we're really of the opinion now that these highly toxic neonicotinoid insecticides have no place in ornamental settings. There are other solutions for pest control. And so this is the largest documented bumblebee kill in North America. And it was really, really a tragic event. I'm the one who took these pictures. I was on site. It was really a disturbing scene to behold. That said, some good has come from this. The state of Oregon has adopted laws that now prevent the use of this chemical on linden trees. And it's broadened the conversation about the use of pesticides and how we can do better for pollinators throughout the region. And hopefully these will spread out and take hold throughout the rest of the country as well. On top of the factors that we've already talked about, there's climate change, which is changing the time that plants are blooming. It seems that it's forcing bumblebees out of the southern portions of their range while not allowing them to expand into far northern parts of their range. So it's really having a dramatic effect on the animals as they're already struggling with these other threats. On top of those threats, there's an additional threat that's probably having a significant role in the decline of many species in North America, and that's the use of commercial bumblebees. In Katie's portion of her talk, she mentioned commercial bumblebees and that some tomato farmers are especially using these animals because they're really good at buzz pollination. So in the mid-1990s, we learned, I say we, I really mean we as a humanity learned how to grow bumblebees in boxes and then have them reproduce in a laboratory and then ship them all over the country for this purpose as we started growing peppers and tomatoes in greenhouses. Excuse me. So once we started doing that, as you can imagine, if you take an animal that reproduces out in the wild and then force it to reproduce in high density in a laboratory, you're going to get disease outbreaks. And likely what happened is these commercial bumblebees then developed some resistance to that disease, but then we shipped them all over the country. And so the commercial bumblebees were actually, as they flew out of their boxes and interacted with wild bumblebees on flowers, both inside and outside of greenhouses, they spread and amplified this disease across North America. So it really exposed a lot of these animals to a pathogen, which likely had a dramatic impact on them. This is believed to be the leading cause of decline of those 4 species I showed at the beginning of this section: the rusty-patched bumblebee, Franklin's bumblebee, the yellow-banded bumblebee, and the rusty-patched bumblebee. It's believed that pathogens are the major cause of decline in those species, and that those pathogens were spread and amplified by commercial bumblebees. Now, it's important to recognize that the disease alone may not have done this, but when you put the disease on top of all of the other factors, you can have a really unique effect. It's just like human beings. When we're stressed, our immune systems are diminished as well, and we're more likely to get sick. It's likely the same thing is happening with bumblebees. They're already stressed. They're having to work harder to find food, and then you throw a disease at them, and they just don't have the capacity to handle it. Along with that, it's not just, oops, sorry, having a little bit of a delay here in my advancing my slides. It's not just commercial bumblebees that have an impact on bumblebees and other wild bees. Honeybees are are beautiful animals. They're really important agricultural pollinators, and they're great for hobbyists. If you like honey and you want to learn from honeybees, and you want to learn from a social insect and use them as an education tool, they're really great for that. But being a honeybee keeper is not practicing bee conservation. Honeybees live in colonies of 10 to 50,000 bees, and all of those mouths need to be fed. They extract a ton of resources from the landscape. And in addition to that, they also have been shown to transmit diseases to our native bees. So honeybees, as I mentioned, they're a great hobby. They're great to have. They're important agricultural pollinators, and we need to be providing habitat for them in our agricultural settings to keep them healthy so that we can keep that system going. But being a honeybee keeper at home for bee conservation, there are better ways to do that. And creating habitat is really the best thing that you can do for honeybees and for native bees. If we put food in the ground for bees, you're going to feed our bumblebees, our native bees, and also the honeybees that are out looking for food. So creating habitat is really the best thing that you can do for pollinator conservation. Speaking of which, I'm going to transition now and talk a little bit about the conservation efforts that we have going on at Xerces Society, and that we're encouraging others to take on, in addition to the Atlas project that we've already talked to you about. So hopefully the rest of this evening can end on a high note, while we sort of have just landed in a deep, depressing note of bee conservation. But one of the great things I think about pollinator conservation is that there is actually something that all of us can do about it. Whether you live in an apartment on a fifth story, on the fifth story of an apartment building, or you live on 10 acres, you can create some habitat. Even just a pot of flowers on your porch, 10 stories up, will likely provide food for bees as they fly around looking for those resources. So we can do this. We can create habitat and improve the situation out there for our native bees and our bumblebees. So creating habitat really has 4 major components. We need to put food on the landscape from early spring through late fall. We need to create shelter, so a place for bumblebees and other pollinators to build their nest and to overwinter. We need to connect these landscapes to each other. So food resources need to be connected to shelter resources, and food and shelter resources need to be connected to other food and shelter resources. So this needs to happen on a landscape scale. And then in addition to that, we need to make sure that these habitats are insecticide free. We need to make sure that we're not causing direct harm on we're not harming the bees that we're trying to attract. So we want to really avoid the use of these toxic insecticides. And this means we need to create habitat everywhere. So roadsides can be habitat, parts of parks, which would once be considered playgrounds and play fields, can be converted so that part of them have habitat in them. We can create strips in agricultural fields that provide food when those agricultural crops aren't blooming. And then our yards is another place for an opportunity. And it's important to recognize, while there are 4 components to bumblebee habitat, not all 4 of them have to be in the same place. If you can only provide food, that's great. Maybe your neighbor can provide a place for shelter. Maybe your parks department can help connect those habitats. So if you don't have space to create all 4 of those, just focus on one of them, and that is totally fine. So how do we do this? Well, one of them are food resources. So we need to select flowering trees and shrubs and wildflowers that have overlapping bloom times from as early as you can imagine to as late as you can imagine. And Xerces has a ton of resources available for planning habitat like this. Hopefully Katie can share some of these resources with you in the chat box there. If you can also just go to our website. I'm sure the Missouri Department of Conservation and Pheasants and Quail Forever also have resources for creating habitat and which plants are the best. We talked a little bit about it in the break between the 2 modules as well. But we need to create multiple plants blooming at multiple times of year all year, as long as you can. For creating shelter, again, this is your excuse to be a little bit lazy in your yard. You know, leave a patch, even if it has to be in the backyard where your neighbors don't have to look at it, where you don't mow it and you just let it overgrow and let the plants there flower and create some thatch and some unique areas. Leave brush piles around, plant bunch grasses, leave bare ground. Don't cover every part of bare ground with mulch and other things like that. And then we need to be thinking about how we connect these habitats. So we can use transportation corridors to connect habitats. We can use things like rivers. We can use rights of way like power line corridors. And we need to be working as a community to create habitats that connect all of these patches that we're individually creating in our larger urban and suburban areas. We need to think about pesticide exposure for bees and reducing these impacts, realizing that there are many different ways that bees and other pollinators can get affected by pesticides. So obviously pesticides can be killed, or bees can be killed through direct contact. If they're sprayed directly with an insecticide, they can die. But they can also, if a plant is treated with a neonicotinoid or a systemic insecticide, then the plants that they might use to build their nests could be contaminated. And we talked about the systemic nature in the pollen and nectar. Another major difference with our native bees versus honeybees is our native bees nest in the ground. And so their nests are actually in the ground. And because these systemic insecticides are water soluble, which means they're more or less absorbed by water, they also get into our water table. And that water table is obviously moving through the ground. And so that can also have a significant impact on bees as they're nesting in the ground. It's another exposure for them. The Xerces Society approach to pest management is to think about the system. So in your garden, if you have a pest there, the easy solution, the short solution that you can think of is to go to the store and to buy a product that gets rid of that pest. But that's really a short-sighted solution. The chances are is if you have a pest in your garden, there's some component of your habitat that's missing. And so this is our opportunity to learn, speak to master gardeners, talk to people that have cultural solutions to this. And instead of thinking about what chemical solution to your problem is, what's the ecological solution? What part of your plant, what part of the ecosystem is missing in your garden? Do you need to put more plants that attract predators or other things to think about? This is our chance to bring education and beauty back to our landscapes in both our agricultural and our ornamental areas. It's a system approach. So thinking about the system and what do I do, what can I do to make the system function? Part of that is rethinking what constitutes damage and what we define as being beautiful. So in a system like this, you might look at these holes in your leaves on a plant and say, oh my gosh, I have a pest problem, and then spray this plant with an insecticide to treat that problem. In reality, these little holes that you see there, those are from leaf cutter bees that are cutting little holes out of that, or cutting parts of the leaf out that they then bring back to their nest to waterproof their nest and to protect their young. So you actually have pollinators if you have holes like this. And so being educated and thinking about the system of your garden is a really important piece to pollinator conservation. So here's a picture of a leafcutter bee then bringing that curled up piece of leaf back to her nest. If you're more interested in pesticides, we have a couple of webinars that are available on our Xerces Society YouTube channel that have been recorded this spring. They're both excellent about understanding what the risks and threats are, and then also thinking about what the best solutions are. These are both excellent webinars that if you're interested in this issue, I really suggest that you go watch. A couple of years ago, we also started a Leave the Leaves campaign. So this is an idea that leaves are actually a very important food resource for a lot of Lepidoptera, but they also provide insulation for overwintering bees and overwintering bumblebees. So leaving the leaves in your yard, or at least in your gardens, through the winter and not cleaning them up until early spring. I think we recommend St. Patrick's Day is around the time when you could clean up your leaves relatively safely in most areas of the country. But these are fantastic. They provide, when they break down in your garden, they'll provide nutrients, reducing your need for chemical fertilizers. And they also help insulate through the winter time, not only your plants, but also the invertebrates that call your soil home. And then using our knowledge to spread awareness, talking to our neighbors, putting out signs, like I mentioned earlier, using nest boxes, even if they're only attracting snakes, so that we can have those conversations with our neighbors about why protecting pollinators is important. I've also co-written with a bunch of my colleagues here at Xerces a book called Conserving Bumblebees, which outlines the threats that I've talked about, and then talks about land management on a larger scale. I think Katie will provide a link to this for you if you'd like to download it and read it yourself. This is particularly directed at people who manage larger portions of land. If you manage a small natural area, or if you're a farmer, there are recommendations in here about how you might best manage that land, thinking about the bumblebee life cycle. There's also plant lists and identification guides in there for homeowners. And that's just really scratching the surface of the treasure trove of information that's available from the Xerces Society website. We have a resource center that is full of all kinds of information, everything from how to do site preparation, to how to collect your own wildflower seeds, to which flowers to plant to attract the most diverse pollinators, where to find milkweeds, how to grow milkweeds, et cetera, et cetera. And those are available at our resource center. And I think Katie will also share a link to that with you. If not, there's a URL that you can see at the bottom there. And with that, I think that is the end of our program for this evening. It looks like we've got some time to answer any questions, but I just want to remind you that session 2 of the webinar will be tomorrow night, same time, same bat channel, same everything, just tomorrow. It should be the same link that you had to get into the webinar today should work for tomorrow. Tomorrow we're going to cover how to participate in the Atlas project from A to Z. So we'll really talk about everything from how to adopt a grid cell to how to submit your data and everything in between. And then we'll end tomorrow night by going through how do we identify bumblebees and what factors we look at, and we'll introduce you to the creatures that you would find in your backyard and in natural areas throughout Missouri. And with that, I will say thank you very much, and we'll take any questions that you have.
Thanks, Rich. So we do have a couple questions in here. The first one is asking about potential new queens and how they're created. How are new queens different from worker bees?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's not, to the best of my understanding, it is not like honeybees where the queens are sort of fed some royal jelly. It seems to be just the amount of resources that are fed to the larvae as they're developing. So as the colony builds up more and more resources, the better fed individuals can develop more robustly and have a better reproductive system and then develop into queens.
And do these new queens collect pollen, or do they just drink nectar?
They don't collect pollen in that you wouldn't find pollen on their legs, but they are very likely eating pollen while they are on flowers. I occasionally have seen fall queens with pollen on their legs, and this has confused me. I think in some warmer areas, there may be some species that are sort of moving to not overwintering and trying to have sort of a year-round colony. And so You may see some fall queens collecting pollen, and that you may actually see it on their legs, but for the most part, they do not collect pollen to bring back to the nest. They just will eat pollen while they're on flowers and drink nectar.
Then there's one that I can answer here if you want to take a look at some of the other questions, Rich. One of them is asking about specialist bees, and are there bees that will only feed on one type of plant, similar to monarchs and their relationship with milkweed? And the answer to that is yes, we do have specialist bees. They're not quite as tight as the monarch and the milkweed, but many bees will forage on one family, like the aster family. So you might find a sunflower bee who is restricted to foraging on different types of sunflowers.
Interesting question here from Christine Bates about recovering chemically treated sites and how long that might be. There is some remediation that you can do for chemically treated sites. And some of these systemic neonicotinoids that are in the soil, they seem to be active in the soil, or at least in the woody plants in that area, for sort of 5 to 7 years after even a single application. So they can be active for quite some time. And it's also important to realize that these chemicals, as they break down, can sometimes even create even more dangerous chemicals. So as they sort of break down, some of their byproducts can actually be just as dangerous, if not more dangerous, than the original one. So it is important to think about those things. I suggest that you look at some of those pollinator webinars about chemically treated sites and how to prep that. I'm not actually positive that they cover that in there. And if you have follow-up questions, I suggest we have a whole pesticide team at the Xerces Society, and I'm sure they could address this question really well for you and much better than I could. So please feel free to look at our website and find a May Code would be the best person to look for. Her contact information should be available on our website. Another interesting question here about native thistles. I love this question so much. I can't tell you because I love native thistles. I think thistles in general are just villainized across the country because we have so many invasive thistles. It's really been hard for us to establish a source for native thistles, although we have been working on it. I don't have a good source for native thistles. If anyone does, please feel free to put that into the chat. That is a great question. It's something we've been working on. What I would say is keep asking nurseries for these things. You know, they work by supply and demand. And so if there's demand for native thistles, we can certainly get a nursery to start providing them. So great question. Why are the number of species smallest for bumblebees as you go south when you look at a US map? That's a good question. And the reason for that is that bumblebees are pretty much cold weather specialists. So when you look at their bodies, their entire bodies are covered with hair, and usually pretty dense hair. And that helps them to regulate their temperature in colder climates. It helps insulate them and keep them warm. Whereas if you compare that to a carpenter bee, their abdomen actually has no hair on it at all. They're completely hairless. And that helps them regulate their temperature in warmer areas. So if you looked at the species diversity for carpenter bees versus bumblebees, they actually get more diverse as you move south, whereas bumblebees get more diverse as you move north. And that's just because of their different physiologies. Do queen bumblebees carry bee bread on their legs? Yeah, so bumblebees, what you see on their legs is pollen, which is kind of like bee bread, I think. What they do is bumblebees, Katie at the very beginning, she showed 2 pictures of of bees and how they carry their pollen. And the first one was that hairy area that she called a scopa. And bumblebees have what they call a corbicula, or that basket that she mentioned. And so they do form kind of a bee bread. They mix the pollen with a little bit of nectar, which creates kind of a cake. And that cake is what sticks to their legs. And it's not just queen bumblebees, but workers do this as well. So queens will do it in the early spring when they emerge from their hibernacula and they're just starting their nest. And then for the rest of the season, that's what the workers do. That's where they groom the pollen off of their bodies onto their legs. There's an interesting question here from Carol about how do males know which females are from their own colony and which are from another colony so they don't interbreed. That is an excellent question, and I don't know the specific answer to that. I suspect that there's nothing. I suspect that if a male encounters a queen from his own colony, that he's just as likely to try to mate with it as he would be a queen from another colony, although there may be some sort of colony or nest scent that they could use to avoid that. But my guess would be that they would have some behavior that would prevent this. This is likely the reason that males don't return to the nest. It probably forces them to move further away from the nest, thus reducing the chances that he would encounter a sister versus an unrelated individual. My guess is that this is a behavioral adaptation as opposed to some chemical adaptation. But Katie, you might know more about this than me. Do you know any more about it than me?
No.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. Someone put in here a chat that said prairiemoon.com is a source for native thistles. So that's a place that's worth checking. For the 10 to 12 species in Missouri, the typical months of activity for each, it really varies. I would highly recommend, if you're interested in digging deep into this, there's a book called Bumblebees of North America. And it goes through each species and shows profiles, as well as when the males, queens, and workers are active of each species. There's also a book called Bumblebees of the Eastern United States that's available as a PDF. And perhaps Katie could throw that in the chat right there. And you can look at that, and it shows the phonology of each species as well by caste. The common names of the agricultural pesticides, we actually have a pamphlet on our website that's called Protecting Bees from Neonicotinoids in Your Garden that talks about the over-the-shelf names for these products. There are too many for me to list here, but we have a pamphlet or a brochure that covers this. And it has the active ingredient as well as many of the most popular common names for them. And I would send you to that resource. It might be available on the participant handbook.
I'll post the link in the chat box.
Great, thanks, Katie.
Yeah.
All right, it looks like that. Will this chat thread carry over to tomorrow? I think we'll start fresh with the chat. I don't believe that there will be, you won't be able to see the history, I think. Another good question. I can't attend the presentation tomorrow. Can I still participate if I watch the recorded version? Absolutely. That is why we are recording it and why we are making it available. We understand that people have complex schedules. And yes, please watch it. If you have any questions afterward, Katie and I and Bill and Casey are all available to, Casey and Bill, hopefully you are available. But yeah, we're all available to answer your questions, and we're happy to address them.
Hey, Rich, there was a couple questions in the chat from David. Can I give those to you?
Please.
There was one about emerald ash borer being sprayed with neonics, and the question was whether ash trees are pollinated by bees. And the quick answer to that is no, I think.
I believe you're right about that. Yep.
And then his other question related to prescribed burning as it related to impacts on bumblebee species, timing, and the like.
Yeah, the best time we find for, and this is hard because obviously we're talking about managing for bumblebees, but you know, if you're managing a patch of land, you're managing it for multiple species. So obviously thinking about those things is always really important. But we recommend burns in the late fall after a hard frost. And at least in the West, it's probably different in Missouri. It's getting harder and harder for us to do that because you know, we get really dry here in the fall and it's harder to get burn permits. I suspect things may be different where you all are. So look into that, but late fall is the best time for bumblebees to be doing burns. Just to go back to your question about emerald ash borer and using neonics, it's true that ash trees themselves are not visited by bees, or at least it's not an important resource that I'm aware of. Remember that those chemicals are systemic, and so the best way to treat those trees is via an injection into the tree itself. If you're doing a soil drench at the base of the tree, or even spraying the foliage as an application, it can obviously then get into the water table or into the surrounding habitat and travel a fair distance. So definitely a great tool in the toolbox for emerald ash borer. But the application method is incredibly important. So just keep that in mind when you're controlling that species with that product. Okay, if there are no additional questions, we will say thank you very much. If you feel like there's other people that would be interested in participating tomorrow night and they're not registered, feel free to send the information to more people. There's plenty of space. We can fit more people, and happy to have whoever can be there. And we certainly hope to see all of you there tomorrow night. So on behalf of Bill, Casey, and Katie, I will say thank you very much for joining us tonight and have a great evening.